Hey, what's going on there, guys? Nick here from Absolute MTG, and today we're going to be taking a look at blue-white fish for the modern format. So Merfolk, or as it's otherwise known as just fish, is probably one of the more straightforward and easy to understand decks in the modern format. With this deck, what you're basically doing is just stacking a bunch of creatures out onto the board. Your creatures are either going to make your other Merfolk bigger, or they're going to give you some kind of benefit like drawing cards, making a bunch of elemental tokens in the case of Master of Waves, or in the case of cards like Spellskite and Kira, they're going to be protecting your other creatures. So basically, play dudes, make your dudes bigger, turn your dudes sideways. So to start things off, the first kind of like centerpiece of the deck are the lords that we're actually playing, or the cards that make our other Merfolk bigger. So for that section of the deck, we have Lord of Atlantis, Master of the Pearl Trident, which are basically the exact same card, Merrow Reejerey, and Merfolk Sovereign. So the one thing that I want to highlight about Merfolk Sovereign is normally with the Merfolk decks, they're going to be running Phantasmal Image. However, with the format being inundated with cards that target things like Gutshot, Mutagenic Growth, a bunch of Lightning Bolts being in the format now, and just all of the likes of Vapor Snags and whatnot, Phantasmal Image isn't as impressive as it used to be in the modern format as far as playability goes, and being able to just have even more copies of Lords in your deck. So what I've decided to do instead is actually just play Merfolk Sovereign as a concrete Lord for the 3 mana that also has the ability to make one of our Merfolk unblockable. But otherwise, Lord of Atlantis, Master of the Pearl Trident, there are 2-drop Lords that give our other Merfolks +1/+1 and Island Walk. They're basically the same cards, so we have like 8 copies of them. Our Merrow Reejerey also gives our other Merfolks +1/+1, but instead, it also allows us to, whenever we play a Merfolk spell, tap or untap a permanent, which allows us to manipulate things in terms of us untapping our lands and being able to cast more Merfolk or have mana open for like a Vapor Snag or something like that. Tap down our opponent's creatures so that we can get over them if we don't have Island Walk set up or something like that. Or to even just tap down our opponent's lands and then force them to not be able to do as much in their actual turn. And then the Merfolk Sovereign, which I explained, is just 2 more slots for 2 lords that will ultimately allow one of our Merfolks to be unblockable, again, if we don't have the Island Walk set up. As for the rest of the creatures that we're playing, we have a playset of Silvergill Adept, which whenever it comes into play, we draw a card. And if we're casting it from our hand, we have to reveal a Merfolk card from our hand or pay 3 mana as an additional cost to actually casting it. One thing to remember with AEther Vial is if you're putting the Silvergill Adept into play off of AEther Vial, you don't have to reveal or pay any mana for that additional cost whatsoever, just because you're putting it into play and you're not actually casting it. We have Tidebinder Mage as a 4-of as well. So the Tidebinder Mage, whenever you come into the matchups where your opponent's not playing red or green creatures, the card is very easy to side out. But Tidebinder Mage is really good at just keeping valuable red and green beaters that your opponents may have tapped down, things like Tarmogoyf, even Monastery Swiftspear, especially if you can AEther Vial it in. You can keep like pretty valuable cards that your opponents have tapped down, which is a really good thing, especially whenever you're playing against other creature-based decks. We have a playset of Master of Waves, which unfortunately doesn't interact with the other Merfolk in our deck. However, whenever it enters the battlefield, it is going to give us a number of 1/0 blue elemental creature tokens onto the battlefield equal to our devotion to blue. And the Master of Waves himself gives +1/+1 to our elemental creatures, and he also has protection from red. So Master of Waves is just one of those cards that after you kind of set up your board with a bunch of your Merfolks and Lords and whatnot, then you drop a Master of Waves, make a bunch of elementals, and hope your opponent doesn't have a way to actually deal with the Master of Waves, so you can just pretty much get in for lethal. As for the protection that we're playing in terms of creatures, we have 2 Spellskite and 2 Kira for any disruption for our opponent's spells, as well as even disruption for our opponent's combos and stuff. So the Spellskite is good main board for the Infect, Boggles, And the Splinter Twin matchups, just because you can disrupt what they're trying to do. Spellskite's also good at like redirecting lightning bolts and even like a Vapor Snag if it means the difference between like winning or losing a game, or even just losing a whole lot of board state from it. But the Spellskite's usually extremely good at disrupting a whole lot of things that our opponent's doing, and keeps our creatures pretty well protected. But otherwise, the Kira pretty much gives our creatures a bubble for the turn. And it says that while it's on the battlefield, creatures we control have, whenever this creature becomes the target of a speller ability for the first time, counter that speller ability, which is pretty good most times as far as us just not having like our Master of Waves get Vapor Snagged or something like that, or at least once per turn. As for the non-creature spells that we're playing in the deck, we have AEther Vial, which basically allows us to cheat out creatures onto the battlefield. So at the beginning of our upkeep, we can put a charge counter on the AEther Vial. We can tap the AEther Vial and put a creature with converted mana cost equal to the amount of counters on AEther Vial. So whenever you're actually playing with AEther Vial, there's a lot of variability in how high you actually want to go with the counters. There's always that, like, alright, well, I'm in top deck mode, should I keep this on like 2, or should I go up to 3? Should I keep this on 3, or should I actually go up to 4 if I'm only at 3 lands and maybe I draw a Master of Waves? But ultimately, AEther Vial is just one of those easy ways that you play it on turn 1, and then from there on out, because so many of our creatures overlap in converted mana cost, it's pretty easy to get some free cards out onto the battlefield each turn, or in response to your opponent, like declaring blockers or whatnot, and just manipulating what's going on the board. And then we have 2 Vapor Snag for a little bit more like creature control. It's just an improved unsummon. Send our opponent's creatures back to their hand. And we have 4 Spreading Seas, which is pretty much good for like the Tron matchup, or any of the matchups where your opponent's playing a greedy mana base. So the decks like Jund and Junk, the Spreading Seas is pretty good against them. It turns one of our opponent's lands into an island, which enables our island walk. In the matchups where our opponent actually is playing islands, then we already have that island walk pretty easily set up for us. Because the Spreading Seas also cantrips, it ends up being a very good resource for setting up some unblockable creatures for you, as well as throwing your opponent's mana base off. But in the case of matchups like Tron, the Spreading Seas is pretty important, but for some of the other matchups, the Spreading Seas comes out pretty often. Now, while you guys were watching the main board discussion for the deck, you may have been thinking to yourself, well, this is a blue-white Merfolk deck, where's all of the white that you're actually splashing for? And all of it's actually just in our sideboard. So the reason why we actually splash in this deck for the second color is to get better cards in our sideboard, because whenever you're actually just playing mono blue Merfolk, your card pool and the options that you have for sideboarding aren't really as impressive as they are whenever you get to splash for a second color and have a little bit more to actually work with. So we have a variety of different cards that just end up being really good up against a lot of the more popular matchups and decks that are actually being played in Modern right now. So for the sideboard, I have a Dismember, Vapor Snag, Kataki War's Wage, 2 Stony Silence, 2 Ethersworn Canonist, Rest in Peace, Reinforcements of the Army, 3 Kor Firewalker, Spellskite, and 2 Hushwing Gryff. So the more you guys look at this, it's not really just a strictly Merfolk tribal deck. This is kind of like Merfolk and friends as far as like our sideboard is concerned. But the great thing about these white creatures that we have in our sideboard is that we can actually just AEther Vial them in. So even if we have like a Cavern of Souls or something like that that's naming Merfolk, we still have our AEther Vial that can cheat these cards into play, and it can just throw them out onto the table. And they interact pretty interestingly in a lot of the different matchups that we're going to address here. So the Dismember and the Vapor Snag are for the creature-based matchups. Dismember more so for matchups like Splinter Twin, where you absolutely need to have that removal if your opponent's trying to combo off. But Dismember is also good for the pod matchups where your opponent has some interactions and some combos that they can actually utilize as well. So the Dismember ends up being a good source of removal for the combo dependent decks or the combo influence decks. Vapor Snag is just kind of a catch-all for creature-based decks. It's just an unsummon, and an unsummon's pretty much just what we want because we're trying to overwhelm our opponent with our creatures and the size of our creatures. The Kataki and the 2 Stony Silence are for the matchups like Affinity. Kataki is basically going to force our opponent to start sacking artifacts because they can't pay for all of them because they have a upkeep cost. Whereas the Stony Silence basically shuts off our opponent's ability to use the activated abilities of their artifacts, so cards like Mox Opal and whatnot. So both of them have important roles. The Kataki does run the risk of being like Galvanic Blasted away. However, the Stony Silence doesn't really shut the entire deck off from doing anything. Your opponent can vomit their entire hand by the time you actually play a Stony Silence. So I've pretty much decided to play like the 2-in-1 split with these cards. The Ethersworn Canonist is for the Storm and like the Living End matchups. Against Storm, you shut off your opponent from being able to do multiple things per turn, and against Living End, you shut off their ability to actually be able to cascade into a Living End. So the Ethersworn Canonist is pretty good for those matchups whenever they do show up. Storm is starting to see a little bit more play. Living End sees some fringe play, but either way, having it in the sideboard is pretty much just a pretty good insurance policy. We have the 1 Rest in Peace for matchups like Living End, Storm, any decks that interact in the graveyard exclusively. The Rest in Peace is pretty good for them. We have 1 Reinforcements of the Army and 3 Kor Firewalker for the matchups like Burn. So any matchup that's trying to outtempo us and outgrind us, we want to have these cards, especially if they're playing red. So up against red, the Kor Firewalker lets us gain back a whole lot of life off our opponent actually casting red spells. Whereas the Reinforcements of the Army is good up against grindy matchups, even like Delver, where we can just gain back a whole bunch of life off of what our opponent's actually doing, and the fact that they're actually trying to dwindle us down. Gaining 6 is pretty huge in those matchups. But even like the Kor Firewalker is pretty good in the Delver matchup as well. Sure, our opponent can use something like Vapor Snag on it, however, it still blocks our opponent's creatures pretty well. It blocks the Young Pyromancer and the tokens, as well as Monastery Swiftspear as well. So the Kor Firewalker is pretty good most times in that matchup as well. We have our Spellskite to be able to disrupt the combos that we mentioned before, so things like Infect, Boggles, and Splinter Twin, as well as disrupt any removal that our opponent could have that they're siding in to be able to deal with our Merfolk. And then we have 2 Hushwing Gryff, so the last card, but definitely not the least important of our cards. Hushwing Gryff is good for the pod matchups just because you get to disrupt any enter the battlefield interactions that your opponent's playing. And it's also good for like the Splinter Twin decks because you get to shut off their enter the battlefield abilities as well. The Hushwing Gryff is a little bit redundant because we are playing like Silvergill Adept and we're also playing Master of Waves. However, in the matchups where your opponent's actually trying to win by comboing and having their enter the battlefield abilities, or they're trying to set something up like Infinite Life or anything, the Hushwing Gryff's actually really important in that matchup, and you can absolutely get around not getting tokens off of like Master of Waves and shutting off your opponent from being able to completely lock you out of winning the game. So the Hushwing Gryff is somewhat necessary for matchups like that, and it actually ends up being pretty useful. So that is our deck tech and our sideboard here for Blue-White Merfolk and Friends, if you want to call it, but it's Blue-White Merfolk. So if you guys enjoyed this deck tech, I would appreciate it if you thumbs up the video and subscribe for more Magic the Gathering content. The entire deck list is going to be down in the description below where you guys can check it out. And there's also going to be a deck list via DeckStats.net where you guys can take a look at the entire deck, get a close-up look at each one of the cards, and you can also look at pricing as well. They have pricing for each one of the cards, so you guys can get a rough estimate of how much the deck actually costs. So, thank you guys for watching, but until next time, peace out.
If you guys want to keep up to date with everything that we have going on here at Absolute MTG, remember to hit that subscribe button, like us on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter for all of your Magic the Gathering needs. Also, remember to check out our sponsors of the channel, MTG Madness and AVUgames.com. But as always, thank you guys for watching.